The day for Elias began as usual. The creak of old floorboards, the slightly bitter aroma of brewed thyme, and a silence as thick and dense as a forest fog. He sat on the porch of his old cabin, which seemed to have grown into the earth, mending a fishing net and listening. He listened to the chatter of the chickadees, the steady drumming of a woodpecker on a dry pine, and the wind whispering through the tops of the ancient firs. This world was simple, honest, and understandable. It was his world. That was why the roar of a car engine, shattering the morning harmony, sounded like a gunshot. The sound was foreign, arrogant, high-bred. It was approaching on the forest road, and Elias frowned. Tourists, lost, hunters, not the season. A shiny black SUV appeared from around the bend, looking as out of place among the old pines as a tuxedo at a barn dance. The vehicle, splashing mud, pulled right up to his yard and sputtered to a halt. Elias slowly set the net aside. He didn't stand up. He waited. His heart, usually calm, beat a little faster, not from fear but from a sense of foreboding. The car door opened and a polished leather shoe stepped onto the ground. And then his son emerged. Paul. He had changed. Elias hadn't seen him for almost 2 years, and in that time, the city had completely remade him. An expensive cashmere coat, a perfectly tailored suit, fashionable sunglasses hiding his eyes. His movements had a metropolitan, businesslike confidence that bordered on arrogance. He hadn't just arrived. He had made an entrance. "Hello, Father," he said, and his voice, which Elias remembered as bright and boyish, was now flat, almost indifferent. He walked over and extended a hand, not for a hug, but for a business handshake. Elias silently shook the soft, well-manicured hand with his own. Rough, calloused, and scarred. "Hello, Paul," he replied, his voice just as even. "This is unexpected." "Business," his son said curtly, glancing around the yard with poorly concealed disdain. His gaze swept over the leaning fence, the woodpile, the old well. His eyes held a mixture of pity and irritation. "Decided to combine business with pleasure, check on you and get some work done." At that moment, 2 more men got out of the car, men in severe but less expensive suits, with the identical faces of assistants who know their place. "These are my partners," Paul introduced them, Serge and Victor. The partners nodded politely but coldly. They too looked around, like appraisers who had come to inventory property. "Well, since you're here, come on in," Elias said without much enthusiasm. "I'll put the kettle on." "What tea, Father?" Paul waved it away. "We're not here for long. We have business. In fact, that's why we came." He paused, taking off his expensive glasses and wiping them with a silk cloth. "We want to buy your house and the land." Elias was silent. He looked at his son, and the chasm that had formed between them over the years seemed to have become bottomless. He saw before him not his boy, with whom he had once gone fishing, but a stranger, a polished, successful man, a man who had come to his father to buy his past. "My house is not for sale," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Paul sighed. It was the sigh of a busy man forced to waste time explaining the obvious. "Father, let's skip the sentimentality. Who needs this wreck? You're here alone, in the middle of nowhere. The conditions are Spartan, no running water, no proper toilet. But the location is prime. A conservation area, a lake nearby. My partners and I want to build a resort here, an eco-hotel. Do you understand? This means big investments, big money." "I understand what money is, Paul," Elias answered just as quietly. "But there are things that are not for sale. This is the house where you grew up, where your mother—" He trailed off. "Exactly where I grew up," Paul interrupted with irritation. "And I left here to live a normal life, not to rot in this backwater. I'm offering you excellent terms. We'll buy you an apartment in the city, any one you choose. You'll live like a human being. in warmth, near shops, near doctors. You'll forget about this axe and firewood." His partners nodded in approval. In their eyes, Elias was just a stubborn old man, out of his mind, who was standing in the way of big business. "My life is here, Paul." Elias stood up. His old but still powerful frame seemed to fill the entire porch. "And I don't need your apartment. I've said my piece. The house is not for sale." Paul frowned. He was not used to being refused. "Father, don't be a fool. This isn't a request. We've already started the paperwork. We found a loophole in the law. This plot can be declared inefficiently used and put up for auction. And we will, of course, win it. I'm offering to solve this amicably. Take the money and leave with dignity." "With dignity?" Elias chuckled bitterly. "Is that what you call dignity? Selling your mother's grave and her memory?" "There you go again," Paul grimaced. "Listen, don't complicate things. Not for me, not for yourself. Time is money, my money. We didn't come to discuss, we came to inform you. The decision has been made." He turned to his partners. "Survey the territory," he tossed at them, a note of ownership in his voice. Paying no more attention to Elias, they spread out across the yard, measuring things with a tape measure, taking pictures with their phones. They acted as if this house, this yard, already belonged to them. Elias watched this and felt a cold, heavy rage building in his chest, but not at these strangers, these faceless men, at his son, at the boy he had once found crying at his parents' funeral, his best friends, the boy he had taken into this house, warmed and raised, the boy to whom he had given all his unspent fatherly love. He had taught him to fish, to recognize birds by their calls, to respect the forest. And what had grown was this strange, successful man in a cashmere coat who had come to wipe his life off the face of the earth. "You haven't changed, Father," Paul said, turning back to him. "Still as stubborn as ever. You'll die that way, here in your den." He threw these words like a stone, and there was no son's resentment in them, only cold, businesslike contempt. Elias said nothing. He just looked at him, looked and understood that his real son, that little Polly, had died long ago, died the day he left for the city in search of big money and an easy life. The man standing before him was just a stranger with his face, and this stranger had come to take the last thing he had left, his home, his memory, his dignity. While Paul's partners inspected his yard with a businesslike air, brazenly peering into the shed and assessing the condition of the well, Elias remained silently seated on the porch. He didn't move, didn't say a word, having turned into a granite statue. He looked at his son, and in his gaze was not anger or resentment, but a heavy, leaden bewilderment. He tried to find in this polished, self-assured man a single familiar feature of the boy, Polly, whom he had taught to distinguish a fox's track from a rabbit's, whom he had carried on his shoulders when he got tired in the forest. But he found none. Before him was a stranger. Paul seemed to be enjoying this silent confrontation. He was in no hurry. He took a pack of expensive thin cigarettes from his coat pocket, lit one, and released a stream of fragrant but alien smoke into the clean forest air. He behaved like a conqueror, a new master graciously allowing the old one to live out his last hours on his property. "You know, Father, I'm actually looking out for you," he said, breaking the silence. His voice sounded almost sincere, but this sincerity was worse than any lie. "I look at you and I think, what kind of life is this? Alone in the wilderness. If you get sick, no one will even know. Winter will come, snow you in, and you'll just sit here like a bear in its den. This isn't living, it's surviving. I want what's best for you." Elias remained silent. He knew the price of this best. "We've thought it all through," Paul continued, seeing that his words were having no effect. "This place is a gold mine. You just don't get it with your old-fashioned mindset. The lake, the protected forest, the air. People are willing to pay huge money for this. We're going to build a resort here, not some tourist camp with plywood cabins. An elite eco-hotel with a restaurant, a spa, a helipad. Serious people from all over the country will come here to relax, to hunt. At the word hunt, Elias flinched almost imperceptibly. He imagined these well-fed, smug people in expensive camouflage walking through his forest, shooting not for sustenance but for sport, how they would kill those he considered his neighbors. "It will be the best project in the state," Paul declared with pride, "and you, Father, can be a part of it, or rather, a part of its history." He came closer, sat on the step next to Elias, but at a safe distance so as not to stain his expensive trousers. "I understand this is hard for you. Memories, habits, I get all that. That's why we don't want to just kick you out. We're offering you compensation, a generous one." He paused, waiting for a reaction, but Elias was silent, gazing somewhere into the distance at the tops of the pines. "There are a few options," Paul continued matter-of-factly. "We can buy you a one-bedroom apartment in the city, on the outskirts, of course, but it would be yours. With hot water, with central heating, you'll forget what it's like to chop wood. Or, if you prefer, there's another option. There's an excellent private retirement home for veterans. It's called Quiet Harbor. They have care, 3 meals a day, doctors. You'll sit in the warmth playing dominoes with other old men. The state will take care of you, or rather, I will. I'll pay for everything. It will be my, so to speak, filial duty to you." He spoke these words, filial duty, with such a cynical smirk that Elias wanted to stand up and hit him, but he restrained himself. He only slowly turned his head and looked his son in the eyes, or rather at the dark lenses of his glasses, which reflected his own aged, weary face. "So, a nursing home," Elias said quietly, without emotion. "That's your generous compensation?" "It's a civilized solution to the problem, Father," Paul replied without batting an eye. "You get care and comfort. We get a business development opportunity. Everybody wins." "Everyone but my soul," Elias said just as quietly. Paul sighed in annoyance. "There you go again. Soul, memory. That's all just poetry. We live in a material world. And in this world, your house is just old logs that are in the way of construction, and your land is just an asset that needs to generate profit." He stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his coat. His partners had just finished their inspection and approached him. "Well?" Paul asked. "The plot is excellent," one of them replied. "Level. We can build an access road. Utilities will be a bit of a hassle, but it's manageable." They spoke as if Elias wasn't even there, as if he were just another inanimate object, like the old well or the woodpile. "See, Father," Paul said, turning to him, "business people aren't going to wait around while you sort things out with your soul. So let's decide, which option do you choose, the apartment or Quiet Harbor?" Elias slowly rose. He looked at his adopted son, at his well-fed, indifferent partners, and in his soul, instead of rage, a cold, ringing emptiness was born. He realized that arguing was useless, explaining was pointless. They spoke different languages, they lived in different worlds, and his world, to them, was just an unfortunate obstacle. "I choose the third option," he said in a level voice. "I'm staying here." Paul frowned. "I believe I explained that's not an option. It's not an option for you. But it is for me," Elias replied. "This is my home, and I'm not leaving it." "You stubborn old man," Paul hissed, his face contorting with anger. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. I came to you in good faith, as a father, even though you're not my real one, but you chose a different path." He turned to his assistants. "All right, let's go." They headed for the car. As he was getting behind the wheel, Paul lowered the window and threw his last words at Elias. "I didn't want this, Father, but you forced my hand. According to the documents, this house is almost ours already. We found a way, so this wasn't an offer, it was a notification." He smirked, and there was so much venom and contempt in that smirk that Elias shuddered. The engine roared, and the car, turning, disappeared around the bend, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust fumes and a sense of impending doom. Elias was left standing alone in the middle of his yard. He looked at the forest, at the sky, at his old house, and he understood that this was not just a declaration of war, it was a sentence passed on him by his own son, and there was no appeal. Paul's words, "It was a notification," fell into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well. Elias stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the empty road until the smell of exhaust had completely dissolved into the clean forest air. He tried to process what he had heard. "According to the documents, the house is almost ours." What did that mean? How was it possible? His house, the house he had built with his own hands, the house where every nail, every floorboard held the memory of Martha, his late wife. He went into the cabin. Everything here was imbued with her. The towel she had embroidered hung over the wash basin. Her favorite cup sat on the shelf. The old armchair by the stove, where she loved to sit on long winter evenings, darning his clothes. He ran his hand over the carved back of the chair and felt a lump form in his throat. Sell this? Give it up to be torn apart by these strange, greedy people? Never. He spent the whole day in a daze. He couldn't eat or work. He took a folder of documents for the house from an old chest. The title deed, the sales agreement, the survey plan. Everything was there. Everything was legal. He reread them over and over, trying to find some trick, some mistake that Paul could have seized upon, but he found nothing. By evening he had calmed down a bit. He decided that his son was just bluffing, scaring him, trying to break his will. He couldn't possibly, his own son, even an adopted one, do this to his father. He couldn't. The thought warmed him a little. But the next morning, his illusions were shattered. He woke to an unfamiliar noise. Loud male voices, the sound of power tools. He stepped out onto the porch and froze. A crew of workers in overalls was standing by his fence. They had already removed several sections of his old picket fence and were now driving thick metal posts into the ground for a new high fence. And directing this whole process was Paul. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, giving orders with the air of an owner. His partners from the day before hovered nearby. "What is going on here?" Elias roared, coming down from the porch. His voice trembled with rage. "What are you doing on my land?" Paul slowly turned to him. There was not a shadow of embarrassment on his face, only a cold, businesslike calm. "On our land, Father, ours. I explained everything yesterday. We're starting preparatory work. First, the fence. Then we'll tear down these sheds of yours, and then we'll get to the house." "I'll call the police on you," Elias shouted, stepping towards him, "for trespassing." "Calm down," Paul smirked condescendingly. "The police are already aware, and they have all the documents, so don't waste your energy." He pulled a paper from his briefcase and held it out. "Here, you can take a look. A court order to seize the property pending clarification of circumstances, and an injunction to begin construction. It's all legal." Elias snatched the paper from him. He stared at the official seals, the signatures, the dry, bureaucratic language, and couldn't believe his eyes. It was a waking nightmare. How? How had he managed this? "But how?" he whispered, his anger giving way to bewilderment. "Very simple, Father," Paul explained with pleasure. "Remember when I visited a year ago, asked you to sign some papers for the inheritance? You were grumbling then that you didn't understand any of it. and you signed. A power of attorney, giving me the right to manage all your property. You gave me your house yourself, Father, with your own hands." Elias remembered. Yes, he had visited. Yes, he had brought some papers. He had said they needed to sort out the formalities with the land after his mother's death to avoid problems later. Elias, who never trusted paperwork, had waved his hand and signed without reading. He had trusted his son, his Polly. You tricked me," he breathed out. The realization of the full depth of the betrayal hit him like a blow to the head. "I call it optimizing business processes," Paul replied coldly. "And now, if you don't mind, we'll continue. The workers aren't getting paid to watch our family drama." He turned away, indicating the conversation was over. But Elias couldn't let it go. He stepped towards him, grabbing the lapel of his expensive coat. "Paulie, son, think about what you're doing." A last desperate plea sounded in his voice. "Don't do this. This isn't just a house. It's your mother's grave. She's buried here under the old apple tree. We decided that together. You can't build a saloon on her bones." Paul disgustedly shook off his hand, his face contorted. "First, don't you dare touch me, and second, don't call me your son," he hissed, and there was such an icy fury in his voice that Elias recoiled. "I owe you nothing, old man. You took me in because you were lonely after your wife died. You raised me as a replacement for your unborn child. I was just a living toy for you, an investment in your comfortable old age. So all your fatherly feelings are just selfishness. And as for my mother," he sneered, "she's not my mother, and reburial is a simple technical procedure. We'll do everything in a civilized manner." These words were worse than any blow. They killed the last hope in Elias. He looked at this man with strange, angry eyes and understood that it was all over, that he had lost not just a house, he had lost a son, completely and irrevocably. "You have 24 hours to pack your things and get out of here," Paul threw over his shoulder, no longer looking at him. "I'll be back tomorrow, and if you're still here, I'll call the police and they'll throw you out by force like a vagrant. Your choice." He turned and walked to his car, leaving Elias standing alone in the middle of a yard that was already ceasing to be his. The workers, looking away in embarrassment, continued to drive iron posts into his land. These were the posts of his prison. Elias slowly turned and shuffled towards the house. He no longer felt anger or resentment, only a bottomless, icy emptiness. He went into the cabin, sat in Martha's old armchair, and closed his eyes. He had lost. His life was destroyed, and the one who had destroyed it was the person he loved most in the world. Elias didn't sleep all night. He sat in the old armchair in complete darkness and listened as his world came alive and died outside the window. He listened as the workers, who had apparently been well paid for the rush job, continued to put up the fence under the glare of headlights and floodlights, cutting his home off from the rest of the world. The dull thud of a hammer, the screech of a grinder, rough male voices, these sounds pierced his consciousness like red-hot needles. Every blow on a post was a blow to his heart. Oh, he didn't pack. What for? Everything dear to him couldn't be packed into a rucksack. The memory of Martha, the smell of this house, the creak of the floorboards, the view of the morning forest from the window, all of it would remain here, soon to be destroyed. He felt like the captain of a sinking ship who refuses to get into a lifeboat. He waited for morning, waited for Paul to return. He had no plan, only a dull, stubborn resolve not to leave, not to move an inch. Let them carry him out by force. Let the whole world see this disgrace. But Paul turned out to be more cunning, or more cowardly. In the morning, just as it was getting light, he didn't come alone. With him were not only the workers, but also 2 police officers, including the local constable who had been shaking his head sympathetically yesterday, but now stood with a stony, expressionless face. Paul didn't enter the house. He remained standing by the gate as if disdainful of crossing the threshold of what he already considered a construction site. He gave orders to his men. 2 sturdy workers and the police officers entered the cabin. Elias, the constable, addressed him formally but without his previous respect. "By court order, you are required to vacate the premises. We ask you not to resist." Elias looked at them silently. He had no intention of resisting. Physical resistance was pointless and humiliating. "Pack your things," the constable said, his voice softening, apparently feeling the vileness of the situation. "I have no things," Elias answered in a hollow voice. "Everything I had has already been taken." The workers, without waiting for further instructions, began to act. They worked quickly, without emotion, like a funeral crew. They carried everything out of the house that came to hand. The old table where their family had gathered, the chairs he had made himself, the dishes, the books, Martha's armchair. They carelessly piled it all in a heap in the middle of the yard. Elias sat in a corner and watched. He watched as strange hands touched his life, as it turned into a pile of junk. He saw one of the workers drop Martha's favorite cup, and it shattered into tiny pieces. And he felt nothing. Everything inside him had burned out. When they had carried out the last item, one of them approached him. "Well, old man, are you going to walk out on your own, or do you need help?" Elias slowly rose. He cast one last glance at the empty, echoing walls of his home. "Goodbye?" Silently, without looking at his son, who was still standing by the gate, he walked out onto the porch. He didn't look at the pile of his belongings dumped in the yard. He went to the shed, where his old backpack, always ready for a trip into the woods, hung on the wall. Next to it stood his rifle, an old double-barreled shotgun, a gift from his father. He hadn't hunted in years, but the rifle was always with him, as a memory, as a symbol of his past, his real life. He slung the backpack over his shoulder and took the rifle in his hand. "Leave the weapon," the constable immediately intervened. "It's not allowed." Elias looked at him for a long, unblinking moment, and there was so much heavy, cold contempt in his gaze that the young lieutenant involuntarily took a step back. "Don't worry," Elias said hoarsely. "There's no one to shoot. All the enemies have already won." He said nothing more. He turned and walked. Not towards the gate, not towards the road leading to the village. He didn't want to see sympathetic or gloating faces. He didn't want to humiliate himself by asking someone for shelter. He went in the other direction, towards the forest. He reached the newly installed fence that had been his yesterday and was someone else's today. He found a place where the workers hadn't yet stretched the mesh and climbed over the posts. Paul, seeing this, shouted after him. His voice was a mixture of anger and a belated, frightened bewilderment. "Where are you going, old man? Are you crazy?" Elias didn't turn back. He took a step and entered the shade of the trees. The forest embraced him like one of its own. It immediately became quiet. The noise and shouting were left behind. He walked without following a path along trails he had known since childhood. He walked deeper, into the very heart of the gloomwood. He wasn't heading for his winter cabin. He was heading nowhere. He felt no cold, no hunger, no fatigue. He just walked. And in his head was a ringing emptiness. He had lost everything: his home, his memory, his son, his meaning in life. He was old, sick, and unwanted. His life was over, betrayed by the one he had lived for. He decided he would just keep walking until his strength ran out, and then he would simply lie down under some fir tree and sleep forever. It would be an honest end. He came from this forest, and he would return to it, become a part of it, fertilizing the roots of the trees with his flesh, food for the beasts. It was the only dignity he had left. He walked all day. The sun was already beginning to set when he came to a small clearing at the foot of an old, rocky hill. He recognized this place. It was here many years ago that he had first encountered his sworn enemy, Sullen. His strength was leaving him. His legs were giving way. He sank to the ground, leaning his back against a cold, moss-covered boulder. He took a flask of water from his backpack and took a few sips. He wasn't hungry. He sat and watched the day fade, watched the long, purple shadows creep across the land. He was ready. He closed his eyes, waiting for the cold and exhaustion to do their work. He thought of Martha. Soon, very soon, they would be together. He didn't know how long he sat like that. Maybe an hour, maybe a few minutes. He began to drift into a viscous gray slumber on the border between sleep and non-existence. And through this slumber he heard a soft rustle. He opened his eyes. From the twilight, from behind the trees, he emerged onto the clearing, huge, gray, with intelligent, piercing eyes, sullen. He stopped a few steps away and looked at him. Not like prey, not like an enemy, but like an old, very old acquaintance. Elias gave a bitter smile. "Well, you've come, old one," he whispered with dry lips. "Come to finish me off? Go on. You, at least, are an honest enemy." He closed his eyes, waiting for the final fatal leap. But the leap never came. He only heard the wolf come closer and lie down on the ground beside him. He didn't understand what was happening. He was already somewhere far away on the edge of worlds. He felt only one thing: an unexpected life-saving warmth radiating from the strong, living body of his last enemy. The forest embraced him like a prodigal son. The trunks of the ancient pines closed behind him, cutting him off from the world of men, from the noise, betrayal, and shame. The air here was different, clean, thick, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. Elias took a deep breath, and it seemed to him that he hadn't truly breathed all the time he had spent in his desolate home. He walked without a destination, guided only by a vague instinct that led him ever deeper into the heart of the gloomwood. He walked along paths he knew better than the lines on his own hand. Every tree, every bend in the stream, every moss-covered boulder was an old friend. But today he looked at them differently. He was saying goodbye. This was not just a walk. It was his final round, a tour of his domains, which were no longer his. There was the pine tree where, in his youth, he had carved a heart and the first letters of his and Martha's names. The bark had healed over, but the scar remained, like the scar in his soul. He ran his calloused hand over it and seemed to feel the warmth of her hand in his again. And there was the stream where they loved to sit on summer evenings. Martha would gather wildflowers while he told her about the habits of forest animals. She would listen, holding her breath, her eyes shining with delight. She loved this forest no less than he did, and she was buried here, under the old apple tree, in the land that had been taken from him. The thought was as sharp as a knife's stab. He forced himself to walk on, swallowing the bitter lump that rose in his throat. Memory, ruthless and precise, threw more and more images at him. Here was the clearing where he first put a rifle in little Polly's hands. The boy, frightened by the recoil, had almost dropped it. And then he had looked at his father with such admiration, such boundless love. Where was that boy? Where had he disappeared? What cold, soulless monster had he become? Elias remembered teaching him how to set snares for rabbits, not for fun, but for the science of survival. The forest, son, he had told him, feeds those who respect it and punishes those who come to it with greed. How had it come to be that his son had never learned his most important lesson? He walked, and every memory was torture. It caused an unbearable, almost physical pain. He wished he could erase his memory, forget everything, but it held him tight, refusing to let go. He wandered into the farthest, wildest part of the forest. Even hunters rarely came here. Here, in a deep ravine, sheltered from the winds, stood his old hunting cabin. a tiny shack he had built in his youth when he was just starting out as a ranger. He hadn't been here in years. The cabin was leaning, sunken into the ground. The moss-covered roof was dilapidated. The door was torn from one hinge and hung, creaking mournfully in the wind. Elias pushed it open and went inside. Desolation and decay reigned within. Dim daylight filtered through holes in the roof. In the corner stood a rusted wood-burning stove. On the bunk, made of thick planks, lay a rotted mattress of hay. It smelled of dampness, mice, and oblivion. Once this place had been his refuge, his man cave, where he would go for a few days to be alone with himself and the forest. Here he had felt like the true master of the wilderness, and now he was as much a guest here as the cobwebs in the corners. He sat down on the bunk. His strength was leaving him. The day spent walking and in heavy thought had completely exhausted him. He took a piece of bread and a slice of cured fat from his backpack, but he had no appetite. He just sat and stared into the empty, dark corner. He thought that this was probably the most fitting place for his end. Here, in this abandoned, forgotten cabin, he would lie quietly on this old bunk and fall asleep. No one would find him until spring, or maybe never. He would simply disappear, dissolve into this forest that had been his life. The weather turned foul. The wind, which had been playing in the treetops, descended, howling and whining in the cracks of the cabin. A cold autumn rain began to drum on the roof, soon turning into a wet, sticky snow. It grew even darker and colder inside the cabin. Elias felt a chill begin to rack his body. His damp clothes offered no warmth. He didn't build a fire. What for? It would only postpone the inevitable. He lay down on the bunk, curling up like a child, and closed his eyes. He was ready. Ready for the final farewell, not to the forest, to himself. He was sinking into a cold, viscous slumber, and it seemed to him that this was death. Quiet, cold, and lonely. And at that moment, on the very edge of consciousness, he heard the door creak. Outside the dilapidated cabin, the storm raged with a vengeance. The wind, as if crazed, darted between the trees, tearing off the last withered leaves and hurling them, mixed with stinging ice pellets, into the dark window openings. The rain, which had started at noon, grew colder, turning into a sticky, wet snow that melted instantly on the ground, turning the forest floor into a muddy, sucking mess. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Elias, sitting on the old bunk, felt this grave-like cold seeping into his very core. It penetrated his wet jacket, seized his joints, and chilled his blood. He was shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He knew that if he stayed here, in this drafty shack, he would be a block of ice by morning, but the will to live, that stubborn flame that had burned in him for 70 years, had been extinguished. He didn't care anymore. He stood up and, swaying, walked out of the cabin. He didn't want to die under a roof, even a leaky one. He wanted to meet his end under the open sky, face to face with his forest. He walked a few dozen yards from the shack and found what he was looking for. A huge, old fir tree whose lower branches, heavy and sprawling, reached down to the very ground, forming a kind of tent. Under this canopy, it was almost dry and windless. The ground was covered with a thick, springy carpet of fallen pine needles. Elias sank to the ground, leaning his back against the rough, mighty trunk. He stretched out his aching, throbbing legs and dropped his head to his chest. That was it. This was his last stand. He would go no further. He sat, and his whole life flashed before his inner eye. Bright, disconnected images like an old film strip. There he was, just a boy, fishing with his father. The first time he met Martha, her laughing eyes. Their wedding, modest but joyful, holding little crying Polly in his arms, his heart overflowing with an unfamiliar, poignant tenderness. And then Then Paul's face, alien, cold, telling him, "I owe you nothing, old man." At this memory, the pain that had seemed to subside, replaced by apathy, pierced him again. The pain of betrayal was sharper and colder than the piercing wind. He, Elias, had lived an honest life. He wasn't a saint, but he had never betrayed anyone. He lived by the laws of the wild, where everything is simple and clear. There is an enemy, there is a friend, there is prey. But it turned out that the most terrible predators were not those with fangs and claws. Dusk was falling quickly. The forest was sinking into a gray, damp gloom. The snow began to fall more heavily, its white, silent flakes swirling in the air like a final salute. Elias stopped shivering. His body went numb, and he began to drift into a strange, viscous, almost pleasant state of oblivion. He knew this was the beginning of the end. This is how you freeze to death. And at that moment, when he was already on the brink, when reality began to blur, he felt a gaze upon him. Heavy, attentive, piercing. He raised his head with difficulty. From the gray veil of the snowstorm, silently like a ghost, he emerged onto the clearing. A huge, gray wolf. Its fur was dark with moisture, but even in this half-light, its thickness and power were palpable. Its powerful paws stepped confidently on the wet ground. Its head was lowered, but its eyes burned in the dusk like two amber, unblinking flames. It was sullen, his old enemy, the legend of the Gloomwood, the one he had hunted for years, whose cunning and intelligence he respected more than the strength of any bear. The wolf stopped 10 paces away. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It made no threatening moves. It just stood and watched. It was not looking at prey, not at a defeated hunter. It was looking at another living being, as old and lonely as itself. Elias looked back at him, and in his fading consciousness, there was no fear, only a bitter, ironic smile. Fate, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of humor, to send to him, in his final hour, the one who had been the target of his entire hunting life, the one with whom they had shared this forest, like two kings unwilling to yield to each other. "Well, you've come, old one," Elias whispered, his lips barely moving, "to take my soul, come to watch your enemy die like a common dog." The wolf didn't stir. It only tilted its head slightly, as if listening. In its intelligent eyes there was no malice, no hatred. There was only a deep, calm, almost philosophical curiosity. It saw before it not a man with a rifle, not a dangerous opponent. It saw simply life, which was fading. They looked at each other through the curtain of falling snow, the old man and the old wolf, two eternal enemies, two legends of this forest. And at that moment, on the threshold of death, all their years of enmity seemed to Elias something small, insignificant, long forgotten. All that remained was this, the silence, the falling snow, and two lonely beings meeting for the last time. Elias felt his eyelids grow heavy. He could no longer resist. He closed his eyes, sinking into the cold, bottomless darkness. His last thought was, so this is what the end is like. Quiet, and with a wolf's eyes, time stopped. It froze in the icy crystals of the snowflakes, slowly descending to the ground. For Elias, the entire world had shrunk to the space between him and the wolf. 10 paces that contained 10 years of their irreconcilable, respectful enmity. He looked at Sullen, and in his fading consciousness there was no room for fear. Fear had died with his home, with his son. All that remained was an all-consuming, bottomless fatigue and a bitter irony. He, Elias, whom bears feared and hunters respected, was dying like a frozen sparrow under a fence, and the only witness to his disgrace was the one who had the most right to be, his sworn enemy. A faint, crooked smile touched Elias's lips. "Well, come to finish me off, old one." he whispered, his voice as quiet as the rustle of falling snow. That's right, that's how it should be. The law of the wild. You can't leave the weak. Finish it. He expected to see a snarl, to hear a growl. He expected the wolf to leap now, its fangs sinking into his throat, ending this prolonged agony. It would have been an honest end, a warrior's end at the fangs of another warrior. But the wolf did not move. It stood, motionless, like a statue carved from gray granite. Its powerful body was tense, but not for an attack. It drew the cold, damp air through its nose, analyzing thousands of scents. It smelled the wet earth, the decaying pine needles, the falling snow, and it smelled another scent, the scent of a man. But this was not the scent it had known all these years, not the scent of confidence, gunpowder, and strength. It was the scent of sickness, despair, and fading life. Sullen was an old, wise beast. He knew this man. He knew his gait, his habits, his smell. This man was his shadow, his eternal pursuer. He was the embodiment of danger, a force to be respected and avoided. They had met eyes more than once through the sights of a rifle. And each time the wolf, thanks to its instincts and intelligence, had escaped, leaving the hunter with nothing. He knew him as the enemy. But now, before him, was not the enemy. He saw not a hunter, not a strong, dangerous man with a rifle. He saw simply an old man, hunched, drenched, shivering, a creature from which radiated not the scent of a threat, but the scent of misfortune. The wolf tilted its head slightly, its amber eyes, usually burning with cold fury and intelligence, now held a different expression. It was a wary, deep curiosity. This is how a wolf looks at an unfamiliar, incomprehensible phenomenon, a meteorite fallen from the sky, a strange, never-before-seen flower. He did not understand what had happened, why his eternal adversary, his antithesis, had suddenly turned into this helpless, dying creature. Elias, receiving no attack, managed to pry his eyes open. He was still alive, and the wolf was still standing there, watching. "What are you waiting for, Sullen?" Elias rasped. "Not brave enough, or are you squeamish? I'm old, tough. The meat's no good." He tried to joke, but it came out pathetic. He spoke to the wolf as he would to a person, as the only being in this world who could understand him. And it seemed to him that it really did understand. Sullen took a step forward. Slowly, cautiously, Elias did not move. The wolf came closer. Now only a few steps separated them. Elias could see the gray on its muzzle, the old scar above its eye, the drops of melting snow on its thick fur. He could smell it, a pungent, wild scent, the smell of freedom that Elias would never have again. The wolf circled him. It sniffed the air, the ground around him, the old man himself. Its nostrils quivered. It was reading the story of Elias's last hours, the story of his despair, his pain, his journey to nowhere. And then it stopped again, directly in front of him, and looked him in the eyes. And at that moment, a silent dialogue took place between them. A dialogue without words, in a language older than human speech. Elias's gaze said, "It's over. I've lost. Not to the forest, not to you. I've lost to people, to the one I loved. There's no reason to live anymore." And the wolf's gaze replied, "I don't know who betrayed you. I don't know your pain, but I see that you have given up. And in my world, one who gives up is dead. But you are still breathing, so you are still alive." Elias saw no malice in its eyes. He saw a reflection of his own life, a life full of struggle. This wolf was also alone. It was also old, and it also fought for its existence every day. But it did not give up. "You're an honest enemy, Sullen," Elias whispered again. "Far more honest than those who called me father." He felt consciousness beginning to leave him again. The snow fell harder, covering him with a white, cold blanket. He closed his eyes, no longer able to resist. He was sinking into darkness. The last thing he felt was a hot, moist breath right on his face. The wolf had come right up to him. "This is it," was his last thought. But there was no pain, no crunch of bone. There was nothing, only that steady, strong, hot breath and silence. Night fell upon the gloomwood completely, thick, moonless, impenetrable. The snow, becoming drier and more vicious, swirled in a frenzied dance, turning the world into a white, howling chaos. The wind pierced to the bone, and the frost began to encase the earth in a hard, crystalline shell. For any living thing caught unawares in the forest, such a night was a death sentence. Elias no longer felt the cold. His body was numb, turned into a foreign, disobedient piece of flesh. He had stopped shivering. This was a bad sign, he knew. This is how life departs. He lay under the fir tree, and his consciousness, like a guttering candle, would flare for a moment and then sink back into darkness. He was on the border, on that thin, wavering line that separates life from non-existence. He saw images, heard voices. There was Martha, young, laughing, calling him to the river. There was his father, teaching him to shoot. There was little Polly, clinging trustingly to his hand. These visions were warm, bright, and he wanted to go to them, to dissolve into them. He had almost taken that final step. He was ready. But suddenly, through the haze of delirium, he felt something alive. At first, it was just a sensation, a barely perceptible movement of air nearby. Then a scent, pungent, strong, the wild scent of a beast. And then a touch. A hot, moist breath touched his frozen cheek. With an incredible effort, Elias pried his eyelids open. The world before his eyes was swimming, but he managed to focus his gaze. A few inches from his face were them, two amber eyes glowing in the dark, sullen. He hadn't left. He had been here all along, nearby. The wolf looked at him for a long time, and then did something that defied all laws of nature, all hunting or human experience. He came right up and lay down. He lay down next to Elias, pressing his huge, strong, hot side against his freezing body. Elias felt the warmth. It was like an electric shock. It pierced his icy shell, reached his very heart, and made it jolt. This was not just the warmth of an animal's fur. It was the warmth of life, powerful, stubborn, untamable. The wolf, his sworn enemy, his eternal adversary, was warming him. He was not letting him die. He was sharing his warmth, his strength, his life. Elias didn't understand what was happening. His mind, clouded by cold and delirium, refused to accept this reality. It was a dream, a hallucination, a final gift from his fading consciousness. A wolf cannot save a man. An enemy cannot become a savior. It simply could not be. But the warmth was real. It penetrated deeper and deeper, chasing away the icy chill, returning feeling to his numb limbs. He could feel the measured rise and fall of the beast's mighty chest next to him. He could feel the coarse, thick fur under his cheek, and then instinct, the most ancient, most primal instinct for survival, which had seemed to die in him, awoke. He did something that was beyond logic, beyond his own understanding. He, Elias, the old hunter, who had hated and pursued wolves his entire life, instinctively pressed closer to this source of life-saving heat. He buried his face in the thick fur of his enemy, which smelled of forest and wind. He was no longer a hunter. The wolf was no longer a beast. They were simply two living beings fighting death together in this icy, merciless night. Sullen didn't move. He lay like a great, warm rock, shielding the old man from the wind. He didn't growl, showed no anxiety. He just breathed, evenly, deeply, powerfully. It was as if he understood that another life now depended on his calmness, on his warmth. Why did he do it? What made him, a wild, freedom-loving beast, step over a centuries-old enmity? Was it pity, or some unknown, wolfish concept of honor that forbade finishing off a defeated but not vanquished foe. Or maybe in this old, dying man, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness, his own coming old age. There were no answers. There was only this incredible, unbelievable scene. The old man and the old wolf, embracing like brothers, lay under the snow-covered fir, and the blizzard, powerless to break through their living shield, howled furiously around them. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, and each time he opened his eyes, he saw two glowing amber eyes next to him and felt the life-saving warmth. And he knew it was not a dream. That night, at the bottom of his despair, on the threshold of death, Elias learned the most important lesson of his life. A lesson that neither people nor books could teach him. A lesson that compassion has no species, that nobility has no form, and that sometimes your worst enemy can be your only savior. He didn't know if he would live to see the morning, but he knew one thing: he would not die alone. And for some reason, that was the most important thing. Elias woke to the touch of something warm and rough on his cheek. He pried his eyelids open with difficulty. The world was dazzlingly white, bright, clean. The storm was over. The sun, breaking through the thinning clouds, played on the freshly fallen snow, turning it into a scattering of diamonds. The air was frosty, crystalline, and still. He was alive. Slowly, with effort, he sat up. His body felt alien, wooden. Every muscle ached, but it was warm, alive. Next to him, on the packed snow, sat Sullen. It was he who had just licked the frost from the old man's face with his tongue. The wolf looked at him with its intelligent eyes, tilted its head slightly as if asking, "Well, are you awake?" Elias looked at him, and there was no longer any enmity or fear in his soul. Only a boundless, silent wonder. The beast had not left. He had spent the whole night with him, and now that the danger had passed, he remained by his side. Yesterday's desire to die had vanished, washed away by the icy water and warmed by the wolf's heat. In its place, another ancient feeling had awakened, the will to live. The same will he saw in the eyes of this beast. Elias knew that to give up now, after such an incredible rescue, would be a betrayal, not only to himself, but to this wolf, who for some reason had decided that his, Elias's, life was worth something. "I need to make a fire," he rasped, speaking either to himself or to the wolf. He tried to stand. His legs wouldn't obey, they buckled. His age and the hypothermia were taking their toll. He collapsed back into the snow. Sullen, seeing this, came over and nudged his shoulder with his nose, as if pushing, encouraging him. I see I'm a ruin," Elias chuckled bitterly. "Give me a hand, old one." Leaning one hand on the trunk of the fir and the other on the wolf's powerful back, as on a living staff, he rose to his feet with incredible effort, and so they walked to the cabin. The old, staggering man, leaning on his eternal enemy. It was a scene worthy of a mad artist's brush. Reaching the shack, Elias collapsed onto the bunk. His hands trembled so much that he couldn't even strike a spark from his flint. Sullen lay at the threshold, watching his futile attempts. He did not leave. He waited. Finally, gathering all his will, Elias managed to light a fire in the old stove. The dry branches he had broken yesterday before he had a chance to use them caught fire, and a life-saving vital warmth began to spread through the cabin. Elias took off his wet clothes, hung them by the stove, and wrapping himself in an old, tattered blanket, fell into a deep, healing sleep. He woke to someone persistently scratching at the door. He opened his eyes. It was warm and dim in the cabin, and at the threshold where he had left him sat Sullen. It was he who was scratching, demanding attention. "What do you want, restless one?" Elias grumbled. The wolf snorted in response and placed something on the doorstep. Elias looked closer. It was a field mouse, small, still warm. Elias was dumbfounded. The wolf had brought him prey. Is this for me?" he asked in disbelief. You think I'm going to eat this? Sullen, as if understanding his words, snorted again, glanced contemptuously at the mouse, then at the old man, and turning, disappeared into the forest. Elias was left sitting in bewilderment. What was that? A sign, a mockery. An hour later, the wolf returned. This time, there was something larger in its jaws. Just as silently he placed the carcass of a snowshoe hare, killed with one precise bite to the neck, on the threshold. He looked at Elias as if to say, "Well, are you going to eat this one?" And then it dawned on Elias. The wolf wasn't just staying nearby. It had taken him under its care. It understood that the old man was weak, that he couldn't hunt. And it began to feed him. He, Sullen, the alpha, who never shared his prey with anyone but his pack, was now feeding his former enemy. That day, for the first time in many years, Elias cried. He sat by the warm stove, skinning the hare the wolf had brought, and tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks on their own. They were not tears of grief or self-pity. They were tears of shock and some new, incomprehensible feeling. Thus began their strange, unbelievable life. They became a pack of two old, lonely beings, rejected by their own worlds. Elias recovered, regaining his strength. He repaired the cabin roof, plugged the cracks with moss, and gathered firewood. He became a master of his domain again, and Sullen was the provider. Every morning he would go hunting, and by noon would bring back a bird or a hare. Elias would cook the food over the fire. He ate part of it himself and gave the best part, the meatiest pieces, to the wolf. They ate together, sitting by the fire, Elias on his bunk and the wolf at the threshold. And during these moments, they talked. Or rather, Elias talked. He told the wolf everything that had accumulated in his soul, about his life, about Martha, about Paul's betrayal. He talked, and it made him feel better. And the wolf would lie there, its head on its paws, and listen. And in its intelligent eyes, Elias saw not just animal curiosity, he saw understanding, deep, silent, wise. They were reteaching each other how to survive. The wolf taught Elias the laws of the forest, where to find the purest water, which roots were edible, how to predict the weather by the behavior of birds. And Elias taught the wolf the ways of man. He taught it not to fear fire, but to see it as warmth and protection. He taught it to understand the intonations of his voice. They were a team, a perfect team, where the weaknesses of one were compensated by the strength of the other. Elias no longer thought about death. He thought about how to survive the winter. He thought about what would come next. The wolf, which had come to watch him die, had instead given him a new life. And Elias accepted this gift with gratitude and humility. He didn't know where this strange, limping path would lead them, but he knew that now he was not on it alone. Winter came to the Gloomwood in earnest that year with no compromises. It buried the forest in deep, waist-high snows, shackled the rivers with thick, transparent ice, and struck with biting 40-below frosts. For any solitary creature, such a winter would have been a certain death. But the pack of Elias and Sullen survived. They survived together. Elias, thanks to the prey brought by the wolf, knew no hunger. His small cabin, which he had reinforced and caulked over the summer, became a reliable fortress. The fire in the stove never went out, day or night, and the presence of the huge, warm beast beside him warmed not only his body, but also his soul. Sullen, in turn, also benefited. Hunting in deep snow was difficult even for him, a seasoned predator, but now he had a partner. Elias, using his old hunting skills, fashioned special snowshoes for him from willow branches and the skins of the hares he brought. The wolf, surprisingly, quickly understood their advantage, and wearing them, could move over the deep crust almost silently and without sinking, gaining a huge advantage over its prey. Thus, helping each other, they survived the long, harsh winter. Over these months, Elias changed. Physically, he grew stronger, Constant work in the fresh air and simple healthy food did their job. He once again felt strength in his arms, firmness in his legs, but the main changes happened inside him. The desire to die, which had brought him to this forest, vanished without a trace. It was replaced by a calm, stubborn will to live. Watching Sullen, watching the fierce, untamable force with which he clung to his existence, Elias understood the futility and foolishness of his despair. He, a man, had given up because of a betrayal. But this beast fought every day, every minute against the elements, against hunger, against its own old age, and won. The burning, soul-searing resentment towards Paul also disappeared. It was not replaced by forgiveness, no. Elias knew he could never forgive his son, but the resentment had burned out, turning into cold, gray ash, into a detached, almost indifferent understanding. Paul was from another world, a world where strength is measured in money and loyalty by profit. Elias was just an obstacle for him, an atavism from the past. Trying to understand or change him was as pointless as trying to teach a wolf to eat grass. No desire for revenge awoke in him. On the contrary, after living this winter side by side with a wild beast, he felt how petty and insignificant all human passions were, greed, envy, pride, compared to the great and simple law of survival. When spring came, bringing with it the smell of thawed earth and the chatter of birds, Elias realized he could no longer stay here. He sat on the threshold of his winter cabin cleaning his old rifle, while Sullen lay nearby, basking in the first, still weak sun. Elias looked at him, then at the awakening forest. He had survived. He had regained his strength, and what now? To live here for the rest of his days, in this wilderness, alone with an old wolf? This thought, which would have seemed a salvation just 6 months ago, now caused a strange anxiety. He was a man, and he needed to return to the world of men. Not to Paul, not to his former burned-out home in his memory, but simply to return to prove something, not to them, not to Paul, not to the whole world, but to himself. To prove that he was not broken, that they could not destroy him, that he, Elias, the old hunter, was still alive and worth something. This decision matured in him over several days. Then, one sunny April morning, he began to pack. He put some food and a change of clothes in his backpack. He took his rifle. Sullen, seeing his preparations, became anxious. He followed him around, whining softly, nudging his hands with his nose. He didn't understand what was happening. When Elias slung the backpack over his shoulders and took the rifle in his hands, the wolf stood at the door, blocking his exit. In its eyes was anxiety and a mute question. "Where are you going? Are you abandoning me?" Elias knelt on one knee so their eyes were level. "I'm not abandoning you, old one," he said quietly, looking into the intelligent amber eyes. "I don't know how to explain it to you, but I have to go. I have to go back, not for long, just to finish my story." He reached out his hand and, for the first time in their life together, dared to pet him. He touched the coarse fur on its neck. The wolf didn't flinch. It just closed its eyes and made a low, contented sound, like a purr. "I'll be back," Elias said firmly. "I promise. Wait for me here." He stood up and gently pushed the wolf aside. It no longer resisted. It was as if it understood, or believed. Elias walked out of the cabin. He didn't look back, fearing that if he did, he wouldn't be able to leave. He walked along the muddy spring path they had walked together so many times. He was walking back to the world that had rejected him. He was not going for revenge. He was not going to demand justice. He was going simply to show his face, so that the people who had seen him exiled and humiliated would see him again, alive, unbroken, calm. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was no longer afraid. The winter spent in the forest and the friendship with the old wolf had taught him the most important thing. As long as you are breathing, As long as you are fighting, you have not lost. And his fight was not yet over. It was just moving to a new level. Elias walked for several hours. The forest, which had been his refuge all winter, now saw him off, and in the rustle of the young leaves, he seemed to hear either encouragement or a warning. He didn't look back, but he felt with his back that he was not alone. Sullen had not stayed at the cabin. He was following him. At a great distance, a silent gray shadow, he escorted his strange packmate, not daring to get closer or fall behind. When the edge of the forest and the familiar outlines of the village roofs appeared ahead through the tree trunks, Elias stopped. Here it was, the world of men. He listened, but instead of the usual sounds of the village, the barking of animals, the creak of a well pulley, he heard something else, an alarming, growing roar and frequent shot-like cracks, and in the air was a pungent, bitter smell of smoke. Elias's heart clenched with anxiety. He quickened his pace. Reaching the edge of the forest, he froze, struck by a terrible sight. His house, his former house, was on fire. Flames bursting from the second-story windows were devouring the old, resinous logs with a predatory roar. Billows of black, oily smoke poured into the sky, obscuring the sun. The slate on the roof was cracking with a deafening bang. People were running around the house in a panic. They were not villagers. They were Paul's partners, the workers he had seen on the day of his exile. They were drunk. Empty bottles and leftover food lay on the grass. Apparently they had been having a party in his house, celebrating the start of the big project. And their carelessness had led to disaster. An unextinguished cigarette dropped on an old couch, or faulty wiring they had tried to connect to their generator. It didn't matter now. People were running out of the burning house in a panic, saving their lives, leaving everything behind. They were shouting, cursing, not knowing what to do, and Elias stood and watched as the fire destroyed his past. And strangely, he felt no anger, no malicious glee, only a cold, detached emptiness. This house was already dead to him, and suddenly he saw him, Paul. He hadn't run out with everyone else. He appeared in the second-floor window, in the very room that had once been his, Paulie's childhood room. His face was black with soot, his eyes wild with terror. He was shouting, but his cries were drowned out by the roar of the flames. The way down was cut off. The stairs inside were undoubtedly already ablaze. He was trapped in a fiery cage. The partners and workers, seeing him, froze for a moment, and then, realizing they could do nothing to help him, simply retreated further from the fire. They abandoned him. They abandoned their boss, their master, as soon as he ceased to be a source of money and became a problem. Paul scrambled at the window, choking on the smoke. A few more minutes and the roof would collapse, burying him underneath. And at that moment something happened inside Elias. All his resentment, all the pain of betrayal, it all faded into the background. He saw before him not a cynical businessman, not an enemy who had driven him from his own home. He saw just a terrified man trapped in a fiery inferno. He saw that same little Paulie who was afraid of thunderstorms and would hide by his side. And he could not let him die. Without thinking, without analyzing, obeying only the paternal instinct that had seemed to be burned to ashes, Elias rushed towards the house. "Paul!" he shouted, trying to be heard over the roar of the fire. "Over here, to the window, jump!" Paul, hearing his voice, turned. He saw his stepfather, the old man he had humiliated and exiled, and his face registered complete astonishment. "I can't," he shouted back. "It's too high. I'll be killed." "Jump, I said," Elias yelled. "I'll catch you." But he knew himself that it was madness. He couldn't catch him. He wasn't the man he used to be. He looked around, searching for some means of rescue. The old apple tree growing right next to the house. Its branches almost reached the window. If only he could climb it. But with his bad leg, he couldn't. And at that moment, when all hope seemed lost, sullen shot out of the forest like a gray lightning bolt. He was not afraid of the fire or the screams. He ran to Elias, and in his eyes was not anxiety, but a fierce animalistic determination. He seemed to understand what was happening. He ran to the apple tree. It was old, with low, thick branches. The wolf, who had climbed rocks more than once, took a running leap onto the lowest branch. Then, digging his claws into the bark, he scrambled to another, higher one. He climbed the tree like a huge, wild cat. He reached the thickest branch, which was almost level with the window, and stopped. He couldn't jump to Paul, but he did something else. He raised his head and howled. It was not a howl of sorrow or threat. It was a loud, commanding, summoning howl, the howl of an alpha calling his pack. He howled, looking straight at Paul, and in this howl was a command. "Here, this is the way, live." Paul, choking and crazed with fear, stared at this incredible sight, at the wolf sitting on a tree a few yards away from him. He didn't understand what was happening, but that commanding, confident howl had an effect on him. It seemed to point him to the only path to safety. He climbed over the windowsill, stood on the ledge. He felt for the thick branch of the apple tree with his foot. For a moment he hesitated, looking down. Then, closing his eyes, he stepped. He managed to grab the branch. For a few seconds he hung there, risking a fall, but then he managed to pull himself up and sit astride it. He was saved. The wolf, seeing that its command had been obeyed, jumped down from the tree as easily as he had climbed it. Elias ran to the apple tree. "Come on, son, come down, be careful." Paul, clinging to the branches, trembling all over, began to descend. When he reached the ground, he simply collapsed to his knees in front of Elias, unable to utter a word. He looked from his stepfather to the huge gray wolf standing nearby, to the blazing house that was supposed to have been his triumph, but had become his fiery grave. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. At that moment, the roof of the house collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a column of sparks and black smoke into the sky. It was all over. The old man, his adopted son, and the wild wolf stood together at the edge of the forest, watching the ashes where everything had burned, the past, the resentments, and the unfulfilled dreams. And from these ashes, something new was to be born. The moment Elias saw Paul's face in the fiery rectangle of the window, time for him compressed into a single sharp point. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the humiliation of the past few days, it all evaporated, washed away by a primal, paternal instinct. Before him was not an enemy. Before him was his boy, his Paulie, who was about to burn alive. He didn't think, he acted. "You hang on, son," he shouted, his voice breaking with strain, swallowed by the roar of the flames. He rushed towards the house. The heat was unbearable. It scorched his face, made his eyes water. Elias ran to the main entrance, but tongues of fire were already bursting out from there. It was impossible to get through. "Father, don't!" He heard a frightened cry from one of the workers behind him. But Elias wasn't listening. He ran around the house looking for a weak spot, maybe a window on the first floor. But they were already engulfed in flames. He grabbed a plank lying on the ground and swung it at a window frame. The glass shattered with a crash, but a cloud of acrid black smoke and heat immediately erupted from the opening, throwing him back. He was choking, coughing, but again and again he threw himself at the walls, trying to find some crack, some way inside. He couldn't let him die. He couldn't. That would be his second, final defeat. Back then, on the road, he hadn't saved his wife. Now, he had to save his son, no matter what. In the second-floor window, Paul was scrambling like a caged animal. He was shouting, but his voice was already weak. Smoke was filling the room, stealing the air, stealing life. He looked down at the old man desperately and senselessly battering the burning walls, and in his eyes, full of terror, something new flickered. realization. The realization that the man he had betrayed and destroyed was now the only one trying to save him, and at that moment, when it seemed all was lost, sullen burst from the shadows from behind Elias. The wolf was not afraid of the fire. His amber eyes burned brighter than the flames. He froze for a moment, assessing the situation with a cold animal calculation. He saw the fire, saw the man scrambling in the window, saw the old man, his packmate, who was in despair. And he made a decision. He didn't rush to the main entrance. He darted towards the low, single-sloped roof of the shed that was attached to the house. That roof was not yet touched by the fire. With a running start, pushing off the ground with his powerful hind legs, he made an incredible, almost impossible leap. He dug his claws into the edge of the roof, pulled himself up, and in an instant was on top. Running across the sloping slate, he jumped onto the roof of the main extension, which was directly under the window where Paul was trapped. Now only a few yards separated them. "This way!" Elias shouted, understanding his maneuver. "Paul, onto the roof!" But Paul couldn't hear him. He was paralyzed by fear and smoke. And then Sullen did what an alpha had to do. He raised his head to the black, smoke-filled sky and howled. It was not just a howl. It was a command, short, authoritative, deafening, a howl that drowned out the roar of the flames and the crackling of burning logs, a howl that penetrated the subconscious, forcing obedience. He howled and barked, his eyes fixed on the window, pointing the way, summoning, demanding. "Here! The way out is here! Don't be a coward! Live!" echoed in that incredible animal command. That howl snapped Paul out of his stupor. He looked at the wolf sitting amidst the fire and smoke and instinctively knew this was his only chance. He swung his leg over the windowsill. He felt for the sloping roof beneath him. For a moment he hesitated, afraid of the height, afraid of the pain. But another furious bark from the wolf forced him to act. He jumped. The impact was hard, but the slate, heated by the fire, broke, softening his fall. He slid down the roof and crashed to the ground, a few yards from Elias. He was alive, singed, covered in soot, scared to death, but alive. The wolf, seeing the man was safe, looked at him one last time, and then, just as easily, jumped down from the roof and landed next to Elias. He had fulfilled his duty. He had saved the one who had deprived his master of his home. He had acted according to his own wolf law, which proved to be higher than human resentments. Elias rushed to Paul, helping him up. "You're alive, son." "Alive," he whispered, brushing smoldering embers from him. Paul was on his knees, coughing, spitting out soot, and staring at his stepfather who was hugging him, saving him, staring at the huge gray wolf who stood nearby, breathing heavily, and staring at the blazing house that was supposed to have been the pinnacle of his success, but had become his fiery grave and, perhaps, an unexpected purgatory. He said nothing. He just stared, and in his eyes, full of tears, terror, and soot, something he had so long and diligently killed within himself was slowly, painfully being reborn, his soul. At that moment, the roof of the house collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of sparks into the night sky, like a final, tragic salute. It was all over. The fire, deprived of its main support, the collapsed roof roared one last time and then began to slowly, reluctantly subside. It was no longer an all-consuming monster, but a huge, heat-breathing bonfire in which a whole life was burning down. Elias's life and Paul's unrealized one. Paul lay on the grass, damp with night dew where Elias had dragged him. He lay on his side, curled up like a large, frightened child, and a violent tremor shook him. It was not a shiver from the cold. It was a tremor from the terror he had just experienced, and from the terrible icy epiphany that was now, in the glow of the dying flames, piercing him through and through. He watched. He watched the three figures silhouetted against the fire, his former partners who were huddled by their car, looking at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. They had already written him off. He was no longer a source of money for them, but a problem. He looked at his stepfather, the old man whom he had so easily and cynically thrown out of his own home that morning, was now fussing over him. He had brought water from the well, dampened a cloth, and was gently, almost tenderly, wiping his singed face and hands. His movements were clumsy, but they held such a sincere, genuine care that it broke Paul's heart, and he looked at the wolf. Sullen sat a few steps away next to Elias. He was no longer howling, no longer growling. He just sat like an ancient gray guardian and watched the fire, calmly, wisely, with a kind of universal dignity, and in his amber eyes there was not a drop of hatred for the man who was the cause of all this trouble. Paul looked at them, at the old man he had betrayed and the beast he had feared, and in his mind, seared not only by the heat, but by shame, his entire world collapsed. His whole life, built on money, on profit, on the ability to solve problems, turned out to be a house of cards. He had considered himself strong. He had despised weaklings and losers like his stepfather, with their old-fashioned notions of honor and memory. He believed that money ruled the world. But it turned out that in the most terrible moment of his life, everyone had abandoned him. His partners, his team. Money could not stop the fire, and those who he considered beneath him had saved him. The written-off old man, driven by some incomprehensible, irrational sense of duty, and the wild beast, which turned out to be more noble and humane than all the people he knew. He remembered Elias's words, "You can't build a saloon on her bones." And yet he could have. He almost did. He was ready to rebury a memory, to trample on everything sacred this old man had, for his own profit. And the old man, without a second thought, had rushed into the fire to save him, his betrayer. Tears streamed down Paul's cheeks, dirty, mixed with soot and grime. They were not tears of fear or pain from his burns. They were tears of shame, a burning, all-consuming shame that was more painful than any fire. He looked at his stepfather's calloused, scarred hand, which was gently touching his forehead, and knew that he could never in his life atone for what he had done. "Father," he whispered, and this word, which he had spoken with contempt that morning, now escaped his lips like a prayer. "Father, I'm sorry." Elias froze. He looked at him, and in his gaze there was no reproach, no gloating, only a bottomless universal weariness. "Don't ask me, son," he said quietly. "Ask her and the forest." He nodded towards the dying embers of the house and the dark wall of trees behind it. At that moment the firefighters from the county seat, called by one of the workers, finally arrived. The police came too. A commotion began, investigations, reports. Paul, staggering, got to his feet. He approached the chief police officer. "It was me," he said firmly, and his voice, though trembling, sounded different now. "It was all my fault. The fire started because of me. And the house, it belongs to him." He pointed at Elias. "I set it all up. All the documents are fake." His partners, hearing this, tried to discreetly retreat to their car, but they were stopped. Paul spoke. He spoke for a long time, haltingly telling everything, about the deceit, the forged documents, the threats. It was his public desperate repentance, his first and perhaps last attempt to become a human being. Elias stood to the side and listened in silence. He felt no satisfaction. He only felt bitterness, the bitterness of the terrible price his lost son had to pay for this awakening, the price of a burned house, the price of a ruined life. When Paul, now a detainee, was put into the police car, he looked at Elias one last time. There was no more cynicism in his eyes, only pain and a plea for forgiveness. Elias said nothing. He just nodded, not as a sign of forgiveness, but as a sign that he had heard him. The cars drove away, the workers dispersed. Only 3 of them remained in the clearing: the old man, his burned-out house, and the large gray wolf who had been sitting motionless in the shadows all this time, watching this human theater. Elias walked over to him. "Well, that's it, Sullen," he said, looking at the ashes. "It's all over." The wolf stood up, came over, and nudged his hand with its nose. It didn't know what redemption was, but it knew what loyalty was, and it knew that its packmate was no longer alone. And in that there was its own simple forest justice. When the last flashing lights of the police cars had dissolved into the morning mist, a silence descended upon the clearing, a deep, ringing silence, broken only by the soft crackling of cooling embers and the occasional calls of waking birds. The sun was rising over the forest, its first rays illuminating a scene of complete destruction. Where the house had stood just yesterday, a hideous smoking ruin now blackened the ground. All that remained of the cabin was the chimney, sticking up forlornly into the sky, and the semi-demolished foundation. The pile of belongings dumped in the yard had also turned into a heap of ash and melted junk. Everything that constituted Elias's material world, his past, his memory, it was all destroyed by fire. Elias stood and looked at the ashes. He felt nothing. No grief, no anger, no despair. Inside there was an emptiness, not the icy, hopeless emptiness he had felt when he went into the forest to die, but a different kind, a clean one, like a blank sheet of paper. It was as if the fire that had destroyed his house had also passed through his soul, burning away everything, making room for something new. He walked around what was left of his home. This was where his and Martha's bedroom had been. Over here, the kitchen, where the smell of freshly baked bread used to fill the mornings, and here, by the window, had stood her armchair. Now there were only black, charred logs. He walked to the old apple tree. The fire had spared it, only scorching the branches on one side. Underneath it, in the earth, rested Martha. Elias knelt, touching the ground, still warm from the night's fire. "Well, that's all, Martha, my love," he said quietly. "Our house is gone." He wasn't asking for her forgiveness, not complaining. He was simply stating a fact. He didn't hear Sullen approach from behind. The wolf lay down beside him, resting its large head on his shoulder. It wasn't trying to comfort him, it was simply there, sharing this silence, these ashes with him. Elias turned and looked at him, at his strange, unbelievable friend, at his savior, and he understood. Yes, his old house was gone, the house of logs and memories, but he was not homeless. He raised his eyes and looked around, at the ancient pines washed by the morning dew, at the endless sky where the dawn was breaking, at the mighty breathing gloomwood which stretched for hundreds of miles around. This was his real home. It had always been his home, he just hadn't realized it. He had clung to 4 walls, to the past, to memory, but his home was everywhere, in every tree, in every stream, in every living creature, in this wolf lying beside him now. Paul, repentant and broken, received his sentence, a short one, suspended considering his full confession and the fact that he himself had almost died. But for his career, for his world of big money, it was the end. He lost everything. Elias knew this, but felt neither satisfaction nor pity. Their paths had diverged for good. The village men, shocked by the story, gathered and offered Elias help. "Come on, Elias, we'll build you a new cabin, all of us together," the town elder told him. "We have plenty of timber. We'll help." Elias thanked them, but refused. He no longer needed a big house on the edge of the woods. He went into the forest, not to die, but to live. He returned to his old, abandoned winter cabin, the very one where Sullen had found him, and he began to build his new home. It was not a large cabin. It was more like a den, small, sturdy, built from thick logs perfectly integrated into the forest landscape. He built it slowly, with pleasure, putting his new understanding of life into every log. And Sullen was by his side the whole time. He didn't help, but he was present. He was his pack, his family. They lived by the laws of the forest, a simple, honest, harsh life. Elias was no longer a hunter. He became a guardian. He watched over the forest, helped injured animals, and fought off the rare poachers who still dared to enter his domain. The rumor of an old man living in the forest with a huge wolf spread quickly through the region, and the number of people willing to hunt illegally in the Gloomwood dwindled to almost none. Elias did not forgive Paul. It was impossible to forgive such a thing, but he held no grudge against him either. He simply erased him from his life, like a failed, painful chapter. He understood that forgiveness is needed not by the one who betrays, but by the one who is betrayed, to be free. And he was free. He sat on the porch of his new home, his cabin, and watched the sunset. Beside him, its head resting on his knees, lay his faithful, silent friend, an old man and an old wolf, two enemies who had become brothers. His old house had burned to the ground, but he was not homeless. His home was now this entire, vast, beautiful, and wild world, and he was, at last, truly happy.